On the U.S. and Israel to stop fighting, citing impacts to global economic growth. Joining us now is Daniel Lacalle, chief economist at Tressis Hedge Fund, international financial analyst, and author of the book Freedom or Equality. Daniel, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us once again. So a Chinese regime foreign ministry spokesperson posted on X today saying the Strait of Hormuz is an important international trade route and keeping the region stable benefits the international community. So I understand, Daniel, you wrote an article on your website about this. It's titled, Iran attack escalation may hurt China's economy more than anyone. So on this, can you just talk to us about it? Why does this conflict hurt China more than any other country?
Yes, if we look at the global implications, for example, for the United States, the economic impact is very limited. And as you can see in the stock market, the markets are not reacting to it. And it's also a producer of more than 13.8 million barrels a day. It's the largest oil producer in the world. Now, in the case of shutting down the Strait of Hormuz or the escalation of conflict with Iran, the most impacted negatively is China, because 80% of the traffic going through the Strait of Hormuz goes to China. Furthermore, China is importing almost 80% of everything that the Iranian regime is selling abroad. Therefore, it would not just be an impact of reduction in supply that could certainly hurt the economic activity of some of the Chinese factories, but also, and I think that this is the most important thing, is that China receives those products thanks to the US sanctions and thanks to the agreements with Iran at very, very low prices. And obviously, the alternatives, if there is not a disruption of supply, would be to purchase those goods from crude oil to jet fuel to naphtha, etc., at a significantly higher price. We're talking double, etc. So the entire negative impact of a disruption of supply from Iran would fall on the shoulders of the Chinese economy. And I think that that is why they are so adamant about not being in a position of seeing the Strait of Hormuz being shut down.
So Daniel, as you know, this operation have already dramatically reduced tanker traffic through the strait. So let's talk specifics here. Can you give us some actual examples? What are the immediate and real world impacts that you can think of on China and its manufacturing economy?
Number one, obviously, is that if the traffic going to China starts to disrupt the supply of jet fuel and the supply of naphtha, that would have immediate impact on the chemical industry and on the airline industry. That is obvious. And the impact, obviously, is uncertain, but it can be from disruption of supply to having to look for alternatives at a much higher price. China will obviously try to get those products from, for example, Russia. But again, it is a very, very significant premium compared to the price and the conditions that they get from the Iranian regime. The shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz doesn't happen easily. Iran has tried to shut down the strait many, many times, but it's never done it. And what we have seen in the past 2 decades, in which shipping companies and global suppliers have grown accustomed to the idea that at some point there's going to be a threat due to geopolitical risk, is that most of those ships immediately have an opportunity to go through different routes to the west. That's why only 7% of the traffic of the Strait of Hormuz goes to the European Union and less than 4% goes to the United States. So in essence, what we see is that this conflict is going to generate a very significant impact on the Chinese economy short term, driving higher the price of imports at best, or generating disruption in supply for key industries that are essential right now for their exporting activity.
So Daniel, is there any path for China to completely negate or offset its source of Iranian oil?
Oh, there is. Obviously, China has a strategic partner that is Russia, but it takes time. It takes quite a bit of time. It's not something that happens from one day to another, particularly in an environment like the one that we're living right now, in which there is global uncertainty and vessels have been diverted all over the world, no? So, for example, most of the oil that is stored at sea is stored in the west of the European continent, no? And that also part in the eastern coasts, and that is virtually impossible to bring to China and offset the volumes coming from Iran very quickly. The Iranian regime has said that they will allow any vessel with a Chinese flag to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, but that, to be fairly honest, is a bit laughable, because anyone that knows the Strait of Hormuz is a 34-kilometer wide strait in the most narrow side. And more importantly, anyone can suddenly change and put a Chinese flag and move on. No? So it defies all purposes. More importantly is that Iran shutting down the Strait of Hormuz shoots itself in the foot, because they stop receiving the enormous amount of reserves that they receive from exports. 80%, as I said prior, of the volume that goes through the strait is from Iran's own exports.
Yeah, I had to chuckle a little bit as well when you say a ship waving a Chinese flag would be allowed to pass through. Because as you were saying that, we were playing footage of how small the ships are in the waters. You could barely make out anything, let alone a flag on this ship. So the next question I have for you is, what would you say has been the cumulative impact, with the situation in Iran, but as well coupled with Venezuela, right, on China?
Oh, obviously, number one is that Venezuela and Iran were the number one and number two sources of supply of either free or heavily discounted oil. So imagine the profits that Chinese refineries were generating, and the benefit for GDP, obviously much lower imports, and the benefits in terms of getting cheap or literally free, as in the case of Venezuela, oil. All of that is an enormous benefit for the Chinese economy. Right now, it'll have to find alternative suppliers. Those alternative suppliers are not going to be given oil for free or heavily discounted as Iran is doing, because they're not in the same difficult situation. And even if they are able to look for alternatives from Russia, it's not easy. Let's remember that Russia right now is not a big driver of the imports of oil from China because of the challenges of transport. No, so all of those elements are going to add to the cost of production, is going to add to working capital, and is certainly going to add to the negative impact on GDP from imports. No, higher imports, lower GDP.
Okay, Daniel, just one final question. The Department of War has said that in the coming days, the operation will increase in intensity, with bombs hitting Iran harder. So I'm wondering here, because China has made the Belt and Road Initiative plans with Iran for many years, right? They have cooperated for at least a decade. So what is the impact on this?
Well, I think that the reason why the Chinese government has decided to move to have complete inaction in this decision of the United States and Israel is double. Number one is that they know that the regime is basically over. So it would make no sense to deploy billions of dollars in trying to defend it. The second is that they expect, as in Venezuela, that they will be able to maintain at least a significant proportion of the claims to property, reserves, or long-term contracts. So I think that it's basically a sort of policy of trying to reduce the negative damages, if that makes any sense. And I think that it's also very important to understand that by now we will start to see, as from now, in fact, if there is a change of regime, we'll start to get a lot of information about how much of those funds that have been provided by China and Russia have been squandered or literally stolen by the regime itself.
Okay, Daniel, great to hear your insight as always. Thank you for speaking with us.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
London police have arrested 3 men suspected of spying for China. The suspects were detained in London and Wales for allegedly assisting a foreign intelligence service